The year was 1878, and the silence of the high Texas plains was a living thing. For Eleanor Vance, it had a weight and a texture, pressing in on the clapboard walls of her small ranch house until she felt she might suffocate on it. It had been 2 years since the silence had first fallen, the day she and their neighbor, Mr. Callahan, had buried her husband Walter on the little rise behind the barn that overlooked the endless sea of grass. Walter had loved this land, its brutal honesty and its unforgiving beauty. Eleanor had only ever loved him. Now, she was left with the land. Her life had shrunk to the size of her chores. She rose before the sun painted the eastern horizon in strokes of pale rose and bruised purple, her body moving with the muscle memory of a routine that had become both her anchor and her cage. She milked their single cow, Bess, whose soft, rhythmic chewing was one of the few sounds that didn't feel hollow. She collected the eggs from the half-dozen skittish hens, tended the small vegetable garden that seemed to exist in a constant state of rebellion against the thirsty soil, and mended the fences that Walter had driven into the hard earth with his own hands. Each post was a monument to him. Each strand of wire was a line in a story she was now forced to finish alone. The grief was no longer a sharp, piercing cry in the dark. It had settled into a dull ache in her bones, a constant companion that walked with her to the well and sat with her at the rough-hewn table where Walter's chair remained stubbornly empty. She sometimes spoke to him, her voice a dry rasp in the quiet house. "The well is low again, Walter," she would murmur, or, "That fence on the north pasture needs seeing to." The silence that answered was always absolute, a final, irrefutable verdict. The people in the nearest town, a dusty collection of buildings called Redemption, thought she was mad for staying. Redemption was a day's ride away, a journey she made only when her supplies of flour, salt, and coffee ran dangerously low. The women there, with their starched bonnets and pitying eyes, would corner her in the general store. A woman alone out there, Eleanor. Martha Shaw, the blacksmith's wife, had clucked on her last visit. "It ain't right, it ain't safe." With the Comanche, she had trailed off, a shudder passing through her ample frame. Eleanor knew what they meant. The Comanche were a whisper on the wind, a shadow on the horizon. Their land, this land, had been taken piece by bloody piece, but they had not gone quietly. Stories of raids, of fire and loss were traded like currency in Redemption, each telling more gruesome than the last. But in her 2 years of solitude, Eleanor had seen them only as distant figures on horseback, flowing across the plains like a river, too far away to be more than a mirage. They were a part of the landscape, as wild and untamable as the thunderstorms that rolled in during the summer, and she feared them in the same detached way she feared lightning or drought. It was the loneliness, not the Comanche, that was the real predator stalking her ranch. One afternoon in late summer, the heat was a physical blow, shimmering in waves above the parched grass. The sky was a vast, bleached blue canvas, empty save for a lone hawk circling on an updraft. Eleanor was returning from the well, the wooden buckets heavy in her hands, her shoulders screaming with the effort. It was then that she saw it a stain of darkness against the familiar landscape, near the cottonwood that shaded the trough for the horses. She stopped, her heart seizing in her chest. It was a man, lying face down in the dirt. Her first thought was a delirious hope, Walter. The thought was so powerful, so absurdly potent, that for a single blinding second, she believed it. Then reality crashed back in. Walter was gone. This was a stranger. Her hand flew to the small pistol tucked into the waistband of her skirt, a precaution Walter had insisted upon. She set the buckets down with a quiet thud, the water sloshing over the rims. Cautiously she approached, her boots making soft crunching sounds in the dust. The man was dressed in buckskin leggings and nothing more, his broad back exposed to the merciless sun. His skin was the color of rich earth, and his long black hair was matted with dirt and what looked like blood. A quiver of arrows lay spilled beside him, and in the flesh of his right shoulder, buried deep, was the feathered shaft of another arrow. Comanche. The word screamed in her mind, a jumble of all the fearful stories and whispered warnings from town. Her blood ran cold. He was an enemy, a threat, the embodiment of everything she had been taught to fear. The code of the frontier was simple: an armed Indian on her land was a danger to be eliminated. Her finger tightened on the grip of her pistol. He was unmoving. He might already be dead. But then a shudder racked his body, a low groan escaping his lips. He was alive. Eleanor stood frozen, a war raging within her. Leave him, ride for redemption, get help. But who would help him? The men in town would put a bullet in him without a second thought, seeing it as their duty. She could leave him to the sun and the buzzards. It would be the safe thing to do, the sensible thing. It would be what everyone expected. She looked at the arrow, lodged brutally in the muscle and sinew of his shoulder. It wasn't a Comanche arrow. The fletching was wrong, coarser, made with gray goose feathers. It was the kind of arrow the buffalo hunters used, men who were often more savage than the prey they hunted. He had not been fighting settlers. He had been fighting other hunters on the plains. She saw not a warrior but a man, bleeding into the dust of her land. She remembered Walter in his final days, his body racked with fever, his breath a shallow rasp. She had been helpless then, able to do nothing but offer cool water and hold his hand while life slipped away. She had failed to save her husband. A wave of profound, unexpected resolve washed over her, drowning the fear. She would not stand by and watch another man die. Making the decision was one thing, acting on it was another. He was a large man, all corded muscle and solid bone. She was wiry, her strength born of endurance, not brute force. She holstered her pistol and knelt beside him. "Mister," she said, her voice unsteady. "Mister, can you hear me?" There was no response save for another pained groan. His skin was scorching hot to the touch. Fever had already taken hold. She knew she couldn't leave him out here. With a grunt, she looped her arms under his, trying to lift him. It was like trying to move a boulder. He was dead weight, his body limp and unresponsive. She thought of the barn. It was cooler there, out of the sun. It was also separate from the house, a small concession to the fear that still lingered in the back of her mind. Summoning every ounce of her strength, she began to drag him. It was a slow, agonizing process. She pulled, her heels digging into the dirt, her muscles straining, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The 10 yards to the barn felt like a mile. By the time she got him into the relative cool of the interior, onto a bed of clean hay, she was drenched in sweat and trembling with exhaustion. He lay on his stomach, his breathing shallow. The arrow jutted from his shoulder at an obscene angle. She knew it had to come out. Leaving it in would mean a slow, certain death from infection. She had seen it happen to a ranch hand years ago, a simple puncture wound from a rusty nail that had turned septic. She fetched her medical supplies from the house. A bottle of whiskey, clean linen cloths she tore into strips, a sharp knife that Walter used for skinning game, and a pair of pliers from his toolbox. Her hands shook as she laid them out on a clean sackcloth beside the unconscious man. She had helped Walter set a broken leg on a calf and had stitched up her own hand once after a bad cut, but this was something else entirely. This was a violation. She was going to cut into a man's flesh. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. First, the shaft. She used the knife, its edge honed to a razor sharpness, to saw through the wooden shaft of the arrow, leaving only a few inches sticking out of his back. He didn't flinch. Then came the hard part. The arrowhead, she knew, would be barbed. Pulling it straight out would tear his insides to ribbons. It had to be pushed through. She gently, carefully, rolled him partway onto his side. The skin around the wound was swollen and an angry red. Taking the pliers, she felt for the tip of the arrowhead under the skin on his chest. It was a small, hard lump. She whispered a prayer to a god she wasn't sure she still believed in. "Forgive me," she murmured, to the man, to herself, to the silent, watching rafters of the barn. She sterilized the knife in the flame of a lantern, the metal glowing orange. Taking another deep, shuddering breath, she made a small, precise incision in the skin over the arrowhead. A fresh welling of dark blood bloomed on his chest. He cried out in his delirium, a raw, guttural sound that tore at her heart. His body arched in a spasm of pure agony. "I'm sorry," she wept, tears blurring her vision. "I'm so sorry. Just hold still." Through the incision, she could see the dark, menacing shape of the barbed metal. She used the pliers to grip it, the cold steel closing around the arrowhead. His whole body went rigid. With a final, desperate push, she forced the head through the new opening. The sound it made, a sickening little pop, would haunt her for the rest of her days. The arrowhead was free. She worked quickly then, her movements becoming more certain. She pulled the rest of the broken shaft out from his back. The wound was ugly, a deep, ragged channel through his shoulder. She poured a generous amount of whiskey directly into it. He screamed, a long, ragged cry of torment that echoed in the cavernous barn, and this time he thrashed, his good arm flailing. She threw her body over his, pinning him down with her own slight weight until the convulsion passed, and he fell limp once more, finally succumbing to the blackness. Panting, her heart hammering against her ribs, she cleaned the wounds as best she could, her hands now stained with his blood. She packed them with a poultice of yarrow she kept for Bess, a trick she'd learned from an old Mexican woman years ago, and then bound his shoulder and chest tightly with the clean linen strips. His fever raged through the night. Eleanor did not sleep. She sat on an overturned bucket just inside the barn door, her rifle across her lap, watching him. She kept a basin of cool well water beside her, and every half hour she would rise, dip a cloth in the water, and gently wipe his brow and neck, trying to bring the fire in his body down. In his delirium he spoke. The words were in a language she did not understand, a torrent of guttural sounds and soft murmurs. He cried out a name, Tashunka, over and over, a brother, a father. He spoke of buffalo and wind and sky. Sometime before dawn, listening to the unfamiliar cadence of his voice, a strange thing happened. The silence of the ranch, the oppressive, heavy silence she had lived with for 2 years, was broken. It was filled with the sound of this stranger's fevered dreams, with the sound of his breathing, with the sound of her own quiet movements as she tended to him. For the first time since Walter's passing, she was not entirely alone. The realization was as unsettling as it was comforting. She must have dozed off, her head slumped against the doorframe, because she was awoken by a new sound. It was the soft nickering of a horse. Her eyes snapped open. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long, cool shadows across the yard. The man in the barn was quiet, his breathing deeper, more even. The fever had broken. Eleanor moved to the barn door and peered out. Her blood turned to ice. Lining the ridge a few hundred yards from her house, silhouetted against the dawn sky, was a line of riders. There were at least 20 of them, all silent, all watching her. They sat astride their ponies with an unnerving stillness, their forms lean and hard, their long hair catching the morning breeze. Feathers and beads adorned their hair and their horses' manes. Some held rifles, others lances. Comanche, his entire tribe, or near enough. A primitive, blinding fear, more potent than anything she had felt the day before, seized her. They had come for him. They had tracked him here. They would see the blood in the dirt, the arrow she had discarded. They would think she had done this to him. They would burn her house, destroy her ranch, and end her life with the same brutal efficiency with which she had treated his wound. The stories from redemption, the warnings from Martha Shaw, they all came rushing back, no longer distant tales, but an imminent, terrifying reality. Her first instinct was to run, to bar the door of the house and wait for the inevitable. But then she thought of the man in the barn. He was weak, helpless. He had survived the arrow and the fever, only to be found at the mercy of his own people's misunderstanding. Her fear for herself was eclipsed by a fierce, illogical sense of responsibility for him. She had saved his life. She would not let him die now. She checked the rifle in her hands, making sure it was loaded, but she knew it was a futile gesture. A single rifle against 20 warriors was nothing. Her only weapon, her only hope, was the truth. With a resolve she did not know she possessed, Eleanor stepped out of the barn and into the open yard. She did not raise the rifle, but held it loosely in her hands, pointed toward the ground. She stood there, a lone woman in a faded calico dress, her hair coming loose from its bun, and waited. For a long time, nothing happened. The silent standoff continued, the space between her and the riders crackling with a tension so thick she could taste it. Then, one of the riders separated from the group and began to move down the slope towards her. He rode with an easy confidence, his posture regal. He was older than the others, his face a mask of deep lines and stern authority, his hair streaked with grey. He was clearly the leader. As he drew closer, the barn door creaked open behind Eleanor. She didn't dare turn. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the man she had saved emerge, stumbling into the morning light. He was unsteady on his feet, his torso wrapped in her white linen bandages, a stark contrast against his dark skin. He leaned heavily against the doorframe for support, his face pale with exhaustion. The warrior reined in his horse about 30 feet from her. His dark eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept over the scene. They took in Eleanor, her rifle, the house, and finally they locked onto the injured man in the barn doorway. A flicker of recognition, of relief, crossed the chief's stoic face. The man from the barn straightened up, wincing with the effort. He took a staggering step forward, raising his good arm in a gesture of greeting. He called out, his voice weak but clear, "Moketavato." The chief Moketavato slid from his horse with a fluid grace. He walked towards the younger man, his gaze never leaving him. The two spoke, their voices low and rapid in their own tongue. The younger man, whose name she now knew was Chaitan, gestured with his head toward Eleanor. He spoke at length, his voice growing stronger, more insistent. He pointed to his bandaged shoulder, then to the barn, and finally, directly at her. Eleanor stood her ground, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could not understand the words, but she could read the story in his gestures. He was explaining. He was telling them what had happened. She watched the chief's face intently, searching for any sign of his intent. His expression remained unreadable, carved from stone. When Chaitan finished speaking, an unnerving silence fell once more. Moketavato turned his gaze fully upon Eleanor. He looked at her not as a warrior looks at an enemy, but as a man assesses another's spirit. He saw the exhaustion etched on her face, the streaks of dried blood on her dress, the faint tremor in her hands that still held the rifle. He saw the fear in her eyes, but beneath it, he saw a spine of steel. His gaze drifted to the rifle, held non-threateningly, and then back to her face. He took a step towards her. Instinctively, she flinched, her grip tightening on the gun. He stopped, holding up a hand, palm open, in a universal sign of peace. He said, a single word, a question. Chaitan answered for her. He spoke to the chief, then turned his dark, weary eyes to Eleanor. He touched his own chest. "Chaitan," he said, his voice raspy. Then he pointed at the chief, Moketavato. Eleanor understood. He was introducing them. She swallowed, her throat dry as dust. "Eleanor," she whispered, the name sounding foreign and small in the vast, tense space. Moketavato gave a slow, deliberate nod. He looked from her to Chaitan, and then back again. He issued a quiet command to his men on the ridge. A few of them dismounted and came down the hill, leading a spare horse. They moved with a quiet purpose, helping the still unsteady Chaitan onto its back. Eleanor watched, her body rigid with uncertainty. Were they just going to leave? Was it over? Moketavato walked over to his own horse and untied something from his saddle. He walked back to her and stopped, standing closer than she was comfortable with. He held out his hand. Lying on his calloused palm was a necklace. It was not a grand piece of jewelry, but something far more meaningful. It was a simple leather thong, from which hung a single, perfectly carved piece of turquoise, the color of a summer sky, and beside it the talon of a hawk, sharp and curved. She looked from the necklace to his face, confused. He said something in his language, his voice softer now, almost gentle. Chaitan, from his horse, spoke the one English word he seemed to know. "Gift," he said, and then pointed to her, then to his own bandaged shoulder. "Thank you." Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes. It was a gesture of profound gratitude, an acknowledgement of the debt between them. Hesitantly, she reached out and took the necklace from his hand. Her fingers brushed against his, and she felt the warmth and texture of a life lived under the sun and wind, a life so different from her own. Moketavato nodded once more, a look of respect in his ancient eyes. He turned without another word, mounted his horse, and with a quiet signal, led his warriors, with Chaitan among them, back up the ridge. They did not look back. They flowed over the rise and disappeared as silently as they had arrived, leaving Eleanor standing alone in her yard, the rising sun warming her face. She was alone again, but the silence that descended was not the same. It was not the hollow, aching silence of loss. It was a peaceful silence, a resonant quiet. It was the silence of a world that had suddenly become larger, more complex, and far less frightening. She went into her house and looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror by the door. The woman who looked back was not the same one who had woken up in fear that morning. Her face was smudged with dirt and exhaustion, but her eyes were clear. Around her neck, the turquoise stone was cool against her skin. The next morning, when she opened her door, she found a freshly killed deer lying on her porch, a clean offering left in the pre-dawn hours. A week later, it was a brace of rabbits. It became an unspoken pattern. Every few days, a gift of fresh meat or wild herbs would appear, left by an unseen hand. She never saw them, but she knew they were watching over her. The lone woman on the prairie was no longer completely alone. The people of redemption never understood. They saw the Comanche as a monolithic threat, a savage force of nature. They would never know the story of the warrior with an arrow in his shoulder, or of the quiet chief who had looked into a woman's soul and seen not an enemy, but a fellow human being capable of honor and kindness. Eleanor Vance continued her life on the ranch. She still rose with the sun and tended her chores. The ache of Walter's absence never completely vanished, but it no longer defined her. It was now just one part of a larger story. Her world was no longer bounded by her fence line and her grief. It stretched out to the horizon, to the vast, open plains where a tribe of warriors rode, bound to her by a single act of compassion, by a debt of honor paid in silence and respect. She had pulled an arrow from a man's shoulder and, in doing so, had pulled the poison of fear and loneliness from her own heart. The silence was still there, but now it was filled with peace. It was the sound of home.